Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our 10th anniversary celebration webinar series. I'm especially excited to share updates on one of my favorite programs, Achieving Conservation Through Targeted Information, Outreach, and Network, otherwise known as ACTION. The program was developed in close collaboration with the Walton Family Foundation to address the challenge and the urgent need to promote conservation at scale. Before we dive in, two points. One, a little bit of housekeeping. So during the first part of our presentation, when we introduce our speakers and they have an opportunity to share an overview of their work, all participants will be muted. But towards the end of the discussion time, we look forward to your questions and discussion, taking advantage of the chat and the Q&A features of the Zoom meeting. The recording will be available to all participants. And then finally, it would be helpful, I know that participants can't see each other. So to facilitate networking and further connections and communications, please provide your name and affiliation in the chat box. Okay, so moving on. Before we begin, in the spirit of the Six Nations, I'd like to start by thanking all who have come together today. It is the Haudenosaunee tradition to start meetings with explicitly articulating the purpose of coming together, which is to seek consensus. Success requires a commitment to sharing and exploring each other's ideas and being vulnerable to open discussion. I'm grateful to our speakers, our three experts who have offered leadership in these discussions, and to everyone, all the participants, for your willingness to engage in the dialogue and the follow-up dialogue. So I'd like to take time to read the first verse of the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving offering. Today we have gathered, and when we look upon the faces around us and we see the cycles of life continue, we have been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. So now let us bring our minds together as one, as we give greetings and thanks to each other as people. Now our minds are one. Next. I'd also like to acknowledge our co-funders who have also been very close collaborators in the development of this program, the Walton Family Foundation. And at this point, grateful to introduce Paul Wolf, who's been our close colleague in developing the program.
Thanks, Kathy. We're very excited about this and to hear from the recipients of the award about that. But I thought I'd offer a very brief thoughts on why we are interested in this. This is the Walton Family Foundation and we environment program, and we have a Mississippi River, Colorado River, and oceans programs within that, and I work within the Mississippi River. So our interest is in water quality is our North Star for all of our initiatives. And in particular, in the Mississippi River Basin, we're interested in how to encourage and drive adoption of conservation practices that improve water quality and address climate change in the Mississippi River Basin. So that is why we're here. This infographic gives you a little bit more information, but I am excited to hear from the panel. So I will turn it back over to Kathy.
Great. Paul, it's so wonderful to have you a part of today's discussion. And just the parallel for those of you who are new to FFAR, we are a nonprofit organization that builds public-private partnerships to address challenges in food supply and agricultural sustainability. We work across 4 priority areas that include accelerating, supporting vibrant agroecosystems, thriving production systems, healthy food systems, and a strong scientific workforce. Within each of those priority areas, we have identified themes or focus areas Today, we are zeroing in on pathways to adoption to support our vibrant agroecosystems. It's exciting to realize that we see this discussion as being really integral and informative to helping us better understand how we can improve our other theme areas, including strengthening decision support and accelerating technological solutions. And just to provide context for today's discussion, we'd like to start with acknowledging the challenges that we know we're all facing. And as Director of Sustainable Water Management, I often think about water as the key driver, not only affecting concerns related to aquifer depletion and watershed condition, but also affecting soil health, vulnerability to extreme weather events, habitat degradation, and vulnerability to pests and other challenges to our food supply and agricultural sustainability. Even though water drives many of those outcomes, advanced water practices, and the adoption of those water management practices remain very low relative to tools that we think of for accelerating soil health and climate resiliency. This is not only true for conservation drainage practices, but this is also true of precision irrigation. And this has really come through to the forefront through our Irrigation Innovation Consortium, where we see similar low rates of adoption on less than 20% of our croplands. So we started exploring how do we get these conservation drainage practices adopted at scale through a workshop that we convened early in 2021. Again, the Walton Family Foundation was a big part of this convening. And in that time, the 2-day meeting, we brought together farmers, outreach practitioners, social scientists, and others who are interested in understanding how we can increase practice adoption. And kind of one of the core of the framework was realizing that there's a timeline to adoption, which starts from landowners and producers having awareness of these practices, to generating commitment and willingness to adopt those practices, and then enhancing capacity to implement those practices. And so we shaped the discussion to think through how can we accelerate that timeline? Is it through better supply of the information and knowledge? Is it through working with stakeholders to address concerns related to attitudes, beliefs, norms, or constraints? And so out of this workshop grew this action program. FFAR and the Walton Family Foundation came together to fund $1 million worth of research to explore strategies for accelerating that timeline and increasing the willingness and capacity to adopt conservation practices. So I'm thrilled today to share an update on the program. Again, we met myself, Kathy Boomers, and my colleague, co-moderator Paul Wolf. Super excited to have the PIs of our projects, Tom Isenhart from Iowa State University, Jenny Seifert at the University of Wisconsin, and Robin Wilson at Ohio State. And so at this time, very thrilled to have Dr. Isenhart take the ball, provide a brief introduction of his work and an overview of the action project.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to represent our group at the 10th anniversary of the FFAR program. And so I'm here to discuss a little bit about our project. I won't read the long title there. What we're trying to do is we're trying to scale up some of our edge of field practices in the state of Iowa, but I would like to acknowledge, and regionally, but I would like to acknowledge the partners on our project, and that's the Soil and Water Conservation Society, the Illinois Sustainable Agricultural Partnership, and the Agriculture Drainage Management Coalition. Picture there at the bottom is some of our work in our Bear Creek watershed, where since back in 1990, we as researchers have been looking at the multiple ecosystem services and benefits that are accrued through these edge of field practices, filter strips and riparian forest buffers. And there was a heyday for these edge of field practices after the switch to the continuous sign up of the Conservation Reserve Program way back in 1996, where we had our National Conservation Buffer Initiative to establish 2 million miles of buffers by 2002. There is, through that initiative and effort, a lot of buffers went in the upper Midwest, although I will offer that enrollment in these edge of field practices and the buffer practices have been decreasing over the last 5 to 8 years, and so there is an opportunity for growth there. So we documented, and others in the region and nationally documented, all the multiple ecosystem services and water quality benefits of these buffers for the water that moves through the buffers over land flow or through the shallow groundwater. But one issue we have here in the upper Midwest and across the upper Midwest is for, in many of our areas of our poorly drained landscape, we have these artificial subsurface drains or tile drains to increase the efficacy of farming on these poorly drained lands. Challenge with that is for things that move in the dissolve phase, like nitrate, nitrogen, it essentially short circuits the water quality functions of those buffers, and the water enters directly into the streams. A number of folks started looking at alternatives to that. Some of these edge of field practices, like a bioreactor, a saturated buffer, nutrient removal, wetland, prairie strip, oxbow would all be in these categories. The two that we focus on are these two here, the bioreactor and the saturated buffer. So a couple of schematics there, but really quickly, what we're doing there is we're trying to take advantage of those ecosystem services provided by the bacteria and the carbon and the carbon either within the riparian soils, or in the case of a bioreactor, the wood chip, to remove that nitrate. So as we intersect in both of these figures, the left-hand side of that, the upper left-hand side of it is the field, the drain going to the stream, and in the case of the bioreactor, it's intercepted water run through wood chips to provide that nitrate loss. In the case of a saturated buffer, a control box is put in and that water is rerouted and infiltrated within those riparian soils. Both of them have turned out to be very, very effective in removing nitrate, nitrogen, and they moved to conservation practice standards in the 1916, 1917, in the case of the saturated buffer, a little bit before that for the bioreactor. So they were eligible for cost share, and a number of state and federal programs in the upper Midwest established programs to incentivize landowners to establish these edge of field practices to intercept that tile drainage for water quality benefits. So armed with that, we thought we'd be able to go out, our practitioners thought we'd be able to go out and establish a lot of these, and our watershed projects establish goals to establish these edge of field practices. And then we found out that they were a real challenge to get established. Why? There are some real questions with costs and benefits. These edge of field practices, they don't impact the agricultural production, ideally within the field, either positively or negatively, but they do improve the water quality, downstream water quality, and so those benefits are accrued by the folks downstream and not directly by the landowners. Most of these were cost share programs, and so the landowners accrued some of the cost when the benefits were all downstream. There was time and complexity the landowners required to go through complicated cost share programs, interact with contractors, get reimbursed for those costs. There were tax implications. There were a long time from design. There was lack of technical assistance. And it was really a missed opportunity. We found that it was a real challenge to establish some of these edge of field practices. Kudos to some of my colleagues, some of our colleagues here in Iowa in our Polk County and the 4 Mile Creek watershed in central Iowa, where they got together and identified what are the barriers? How do we get these things implemented? Complicated figure there, but really I'll just highlight that the LOs on the top, those are the landowners. All the rest of those in the yellow boxes to the right are the funding agencies and the state and federal cost share agencies or conservation agencies. And then you have payments, invoices, contracts. The important thing to note about this batch and build, as it was called, is that all of those complexities and administrative details for the practice implementation were taken out of the hands of the landowners, and the landowner had one contact, and that's that fiscal agent or that central point of contact. And then that agency or group of folks actually would handle all the contracting, do the watershed selections, select site identification, outreach, survey, design, payment, invoice, contracting, and really take a lot of those complexities out of the landowner's hands. We found that, hey, it was amazingly successful. And so here's a figure of acres that have gone into these edge of field practices in Iowa, and you see this sort of really meteoric rise, asymptotic rise coming up through 1915 and through 1920, and you can see that really stark increase in implementation through the introductions of the batch and builds. So we thought, what were some of the lessons that were learned? And some of those lessons that were learned was that engagement with the practitioners was important, increasing the technical knowledge, simplifying those administrative details and funding details for the landowners, having one point of contact, having dedicated leadership and staff to these practices, and then timely delivery back to the landowner. So with that, it had a rapid expansion from just that first batch and build. Some other models were introduced. The turnkey approach is another model that takes advantage of some of these efficiencies. And so the goal then was to increase this. But what we're finding is that there's really variation within the state and across the states and regions. What we're seeing is really pretty interesting. There are a number of groups that are stepping forward with these to take the leadership in the batch and build. Some of these are agribusinesses, non-governmental organizations, really unique partnerships. But there was a lot of variation in the different tweakings of the models. And so there's some real challenges within Iowa and then certainly across the states. A recent study by our ISU Extension and Outreach said that there's still a lack of awareness and understanding of what these edge of field practices and what that means. There's still challenges with implementation. And particularly what we're finding is once we get these practices out, that there's challenges with maintenance, ongoing maintenance and management of these systems. Technical assistance, administrative complexity, there's still a number of details that need to be worked out as we scale these up. And what practices are suitable in other regions? We don't need to just focus on saturated buffers and bioreactors. These other practices could also be implemented with a similar model. So what's our strategy? Through the FFAR support, we're looking at what are the current conditions within the 6 states? What are those in the upper Midwest? What are those funding models that are out there? Examples of successful conservation delivery models. What's the current funding and technical assistance? And then we're using an interview approach to interview key stakeholders and landowners about these novel approaches and said, what are the features that enable that success? So what does that fiscal agent need to know? What do the technical providers and the designers need to know? What are the key successes for the contractors? And how do we overcome these barriers to implementation? And then identify the key elements that already exist in these states and how do we take advantage of that? So What do we hope to accomplish? Well, we're just finished up our first year of that. We plan on reporting on the current conservation and do an inventory of the edge of field implementation to support those states in the states of interest. And then key is to use the output from those interviews to come up with some generalized process models and toolkits and say, well, what are the essential elements if it's going to be a Polk County or a city of Cedar Rapids or an agribusiness or a non-governmental organization or different states? How do we adapt these lessons that were learned, and how do we apply that in different situations? We're using combined with some of the research and some of the other data that's being collected, we're trying to use that to improve the decision support tools. Specifically, we're working to improve agricultural as planning framework. And then the long-term goal is also to feed back into those conservation practice standards that are used as guideposts for the implementations of these practices. And so with that, again, I appreciate the opportunity to present a quick introduction to our project, and I'll look forward to our conversation.
Fantastic, Tom. Thank you. And pass the ball to Jenny.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Tom. Bear with me just 1 second. All right. So I'm excited to talk to you about the project that I am part of. And the nutshell to know about what we're doing, you can see the title there, but we're essentially testing a couple of farmer outreach approaches that are really geared around social norms and sort of this idea of how do we cultivate a culture of conservation in the Mississippi River Basin. I want to acknowledge my collaborators. This is definitely a Mississippi River Basin wide project. Beth Baker and Amanda Gubbert from Mississippi State and University of Kentucky respectively are my key collaborators, and then a couple of my colleagues, Amber Mason, Samuel Pratt here at UW-Madison, are also part of this team. And so really the big question that is driving our project is, how do we shift the norm in agriculture towards conservation? And there's multiple sort of levels to this. First of all, we're trying to understand how do we reach new audiences. I think many who are involved in farmer engagement can agree that efforts have done a really good job at reaching sort of the choir of conservation. So those innovators and those early adopters to some extent who are already doing conservation have doing it for years or decades in some cases. But we're really struggling to reach sort of beyond that choir of farmers to really reach those who are not yet doing conservation, but we're hoping to sort of bring into the fold. Part of shifting the norm really also means sort of how do we build communities of farmers where conservation is sort of what they do, is that social norm, and can we use virtual spaces to do so? Since the pandemic, really the use of the virtual environment has been on the rise for sort of engagement, and there has been a very little research to date sort of looking at the effectiveness of the virtual engagement, especially for farmers. And so there, I know one study has been since been published, but we're trying to contribute to that knowledge. And then finally, we know that there are farmers who are sort of already established leaders in their communities, opinion leaders, if you will, around conservation or otherwise. And can we really support their opinion leadership to influence their peers to do conservation, sort of based on a lot of research that's showing the power of opinion leadership in sort of behavior change and setting the social norm in a community. And so another sort of thing driving our approach is this diffusion of innovations theory. And if this is new to you, this is a way to segments a population by how readily they might adopt a new technology or behavior. So this is not just unique to farming, it's really unique to any new technology or behavior that can include cell phones, things like that. But it really looks at sort of the characteristics of individuals that makes them adopt or not adopt a behavior, a new behavior or technology. And so, as I mentioned before, there's kind of a general sentiment that, we're doing a great job of reaching the innovators and to some extent the early adopters, but then how do we reach more towards this middle of the curve who I might call them movable middle? Those are sort of really the early adopters and the early majority. what we know about these folks in the movable middle is that the kinds of information they want to know that's going to move them to make a change are things like proof of whether or not a practice makes a difference. They tend to be more risk averse, and so they're looking for that sort of social cue that others are doing this and they're having success and sort of getting the outcomes they want. And so they also tend to have a great deal of influence among their peers. And so really, if you can reach into this movable middle, we can really hopefully get to that tipping point that's necessary to reach the rest of the curve. And so another approach that's really another approach that is used for sort of shifting the norm is really peer learning. And so that's really peer learning is sort of what we are really putting our microscope on in this project. What we know from the literature is that peer-to-peer communication is often considered the gold standard for behavior change. So, what we hear and see our peers do, it really influences our own decisions. We also know that farmers trust each other as information sources, especially about conservation. Research has also shown that farmer networks are a very consistent determinant of conservation practice adoption, and that social norms motivate farmers to adopt conservation practices. A lot of approaches. So I would say that farmer to farmer learning or peer learning, however you want to call it, has really been on the rise in terms of a way to help farmers adopt these practices. And it's all based really in this research. And there is sort of a need for some evidence that's showing that this peer learning is delivering on its promise. And so we are trying to sort of help contribute to that. And so our overarching inquiry is really how can we design farmer-to-farmer learning approaches in ways that reach the movable middle, and do these approaches lead to their willingness to adopt conservation practices? Some of the goals of our project, some of the near-term goals, what we hope to do in sort of the time frame that we're given, is really to improve understanding of what engagement methods work to increase farmer willingness to adopt edge of field practices and other conservation practices, as well as increase the willingness to adopt these practices among participating farmers. What we hope this leads to in the long term is really that, again, that shift towards the culture of agriculture, towards conservation as the norm, and then widespread adoption of edge of field conservation practices. And so getting into sort of what we're actually doing. I would say that our project is really built on the foundation of an existing effort called One Good Idea that my collaborators, Beth and Amanda, are also closely involved with. And what One Good Idea is in a nutshell, and I can put the links to some of the things I'm talking about in the chat after I'm done talking. But what One Good Idea is in a nutshell is a clearinghouse of videos and podcasts that are featuring farmers sharing their experiences with conservation practices, with the purpose of facilitating that farmer-to-farmer learning about conservation. It is a collaboration between extension professionals from several land-grant universities, as well as farmers, and that involvement of farmers is very key to our project. They are very central to sort of the governance of One Good Idea and the development of it. And so really what it does, One Good Idea, it facilitates peer learning among farmers around conservation practices. And there's a lot we could do with it to improve upon how farmers are learning from each other. Currently, One Good Idea is kind of a one-way communication platform, and so there's there's opportunities to sort of build that more two-way communication platform. And so with One Good Idea as our foundation, we have two approaches that we're testing, or we've developed and we're testing to see how well they work at reaching the movable middle, building community, and enhancing opinion leadership. One is what we've called Good Idea Shop Talks. What this is in a nutshell, it is a virtual meetup series for row crop and livestock producers to really problem solve around soil and water conservation challenges and practices. So it's about facilitating farmer-to-farmer conservation. This is not an expert-led webinar. It is literally a virtual meetup series where farmers get together and have a conversation. We're using the model we borrowed from the computer programming world called a hackathon. If you're not familiar with a hackathon, it's basically where a computer programmer comes to a group of other computer programmers with a coding problem, and they all try to solve it together. So similarly, in this context, a farmer comes to a group of other farmers with their challenge related to conservation and or soil and water resources, and they all work on it together to come up with some solutions to address it. So it's really, getting back to sort of that diffusion of innovations I was talking about, it's really focused on problem solving and practical information. That's what really appeals to that movable middle. And again, they want to know what works and what doesn't work. And so this is an opportunity for folks to get together and talk about that. And our hypothesis with the shop talks is really that the peer problem solving and practical knowledge exchange is going to help reach the movable middle, build community, and increase willingness to adopt practices. And we are evaluating our shop talks with a retrospective pre-post survey to get sort of self-reported reflections on how the shop talks have influenced the participants. The other approach that we're taking is called the Good Idea Mini Grants. And this is essentially, a mini grant program is maybe not novel, but what we're adding to a mini grant program is some training around leadership and sort of communication that can sort of help enhance opinion leadership among the recipients. And so the recipients, which we have selected, what they're tasked to do is to implement a edge of field practice on the farmer's operation. And what I should mention, sorry, these recipients are teams of farmers and farm advisors. So they're working together to complete these projects. So they're implementing the edge of field practice, and then they are getting some training in opinion leadership, and then they are creating a video and or podcast that is about their project and what they did and what they learned, that they're going to be sharing out through One Good Idea for other farmers to learn from what they do. And so our hypothesis is that this leadership training is going hopefully to enhance early adopters' confidence and capacity as opinion leaders. We are testing this method through in two ways. We are doing interviews with the recipient teens to learn how the program influenced them and how it increased their capacity and confidence. And then we're also going to be trying to test the influence of the videos and podcasts that they create to see if it influences viewers and or listeners' willingness to adopt conservation practices. So overall, what we're really hoping to learn through this effort, about reaching the movable middle, how well do these virtual learning platforms such as Shop Talks and multimedia reach and motivate the movable middle? We're trying to understand how well does the virtual format work to create community, especially across geographies. That's something I didn't mention that we have found really important in our work previous to this, is that, there are areas where, a farmer might be doing cover crops or no-till or whatever it might be, but they feel isolated. They feel like the black sheep in their community, and they are really seeking that community of other farmers who are interested in these practices to really help motivate what they're doing and expand what they're doing. And then finally, how well does combining financial support with leadership training enhance the confidence and competence of early adopters as opinion leaders? What we've done so far, we have had 1 of 3 seasons of our Good Idea Shop Talks, and we actually are in the midst of our second season, so it's in progress. And then for the mini grants, we have selected our 7 recipients. We originally were shooting for 6, and we were fortunate to be able to select 7. And we have completed the farmer leadership training, and they're really currently just working on implementing those edge of field practices. Just a really quick sneak peek at some of our initial results of the Shop Talk. So we did evaluate our first season, and what we can, obviously these are just initial results. What we can say so far is that among our evaluation survey respondents, which was we got a response rate of 30% based on who registered for the Shop Talks. About 14% would consider themselves an early majority. 69% of all respondents agreed they gained some confidence by participating in these Shop Talks. 87.5% said they are more willing to experiment with practices as a result of these Shop Talks, and then 81% of respondents agreed they felt more connected to a community of conservation-minded farmers. So promising initial results. This is a quote that one of the respondents gave us that I really love. It's getting ideas from other farmers from the Mississippi River Basin watershed was valuable. The other thing was building relationships with other farmers. That's priceless. So hopefully an indicator of the hopeful outcomes of these initiatives. Just thinking about moving, what comes next after this kind of work, some next steps that we are already envisioning for research. That includes, yes, we are trying new strategies to recruit those middle adopter farmers, and we think we need to keep trying new things that are based in social science and based in this idea that relationship building can help us reach beyond the choir. One thing that we are finding is that when we create spaces for farmers, there is a lot of interest from non-farmers to participate, such as conservation professionals or, folks from commodity groups, et cetera, that they want to be part of these spaces to sort of be flies on the wall, if you will, which we think is really great. And we also want to create these sort of spaces where farmers really are given priority, and it's really based around what their needs are and giving them sort of a safe space for conversation. And so how do we reconcile that need for farmers first spaces with that desire from conservation professionals to connect with farmers and their needs? with any evaluation project, you want to do some long-term to see, well, they said they would be willing to do about this new behavior. Are they actually adopting that new behavior later down the road? And then again, I think we just need to continue developing more empirical approaches to understand what engagement methods work or don't work to increase adoption rates. And that's all I got.
Thanks, Jenny. That was great. I know I went to go back and rewind these talks to listen again to the great information and insights that everyone's sharing. Pass the ball to Robin for another idea or an approach to thinking about increasing farmer willingness and capacity to adopt these practices.
Great. Well, thanks. And thanks everyone for being here. So title of our project is increasing motivation and promoting persistence in farmer conservation. And so I'll kind of talk through how we're defining the problem. So very much from a behavioral standpoint, as a behavioral scientist, we see this problem as the gap between good intentions and behavior. And some of this, I think, was highlighted by what Jenny said about the movable middle. They might be kind of interested and want to do it, but we're not getting them, off the fence, so to speak, to try it out. We're going to talk about our approach. So we're applying some theory from social psychology and motivational research around focusing on values, helping people with if-then planning, providing feedback, and how these are things that might help close that gap and also lead to that long-term change that Jenny highlighted as one of those kind of future challenges. And then the outcomes for us is really focusing on, have we increased that motivation to close that gap? And have we created that persistence, or at least put the conditions in place that lead to that persistence? And that's one of the challenges that I'll talk about, is just access to farmers as subjects in research, but also in trying out these interventions and having the time and the funding to really know if these things work. It can take 7 years to really follow changes in behavior to understand if that persistence is created. And so I'll talk about some of those challenges. So problem, again, we're framing this really in our work as the intention behavior or even values behavior gap that seems to exist amongst our middle adopters. So if you looked at that diffusion of innovation curve, some 70% of farmers are kind of in that movable middle. But what we see in our data is that about 30% of our farmers are not just in that movable middle, but they're the people who are quite literally saying, yes, good farmers do conservation. I want to do conservation. In fact, next year, I'm going to do cover crops. Or next year, I'm going to do subsurface placement, right? So they're reporting in past research that they're interested in these things, and maybe even that some of our programs have had a positive effect on their intentions. But what's happening is that 30 to 40%, those kind of the maybe first half of that movable middle, are the ones who can be convinced, but it's not even that they just need to see the benefits of those practices. Yes, they probably still need to see that, but they're already reporting intentions to engage, but they're not doing it over time. So this was just data from the Western Lake Erie Basin, tracking farmers over time and looking at reported adoption versus reported intentions to adopt. And so the dark gray are those people who are consistently engaging in these behaviors, while the light gray are those people who say, I'm going to do it, I want to do it. In fact, I'm doing it next year. But when we follow up over time, we see that they haven't put those practices in place. So our approach, and there's a lot of different things you could think about doing, some of which have already been shared, I think, by our other presenters, but we're looking at closing that gap by increasing that initial motivation that farmers have, by removing barriers so that we can't say that the failure to increase motivation was tied to some of those barriers we already know a lot about, but then also focusing on how you maintain that motivation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So in the literature and thinking about kind of values and behavior, or maybe what we might say are pro-conservation intentions, that should then lead to pro-conservation behavior, and should hopefully eventually lead to pro-conservation persistence, similar to what Kathy presented at the beginning of the webinar. We know a lot about those arrows in between. So we have a lot of good science out there, maybe not all from the farmer conservation space, but from the broader behavioral literature that tells us something about how to move people along that path. And what we know about that gap between intentions and behavior is that we need to better increase motivation. And then for that behavior to continue, we have to figure out how to maintain that motivation. And what we do well in the conservation space, I think, or at least know that we need to even do more of, is removing those really practical barriers, right? So providing subsidies or incentives, providing technical assistance, filling those knowledge gaps. That's where we tend to put our energy often. And we want to keep doing that, but we might have to think about layering in these other strategies as well. So what we're doing in our project is really a series of kind of innovative interventions that haven't been tested in this space. They've been tested, the theory behind them has been built in the broader behavioral literature, hasn't really been looked at in the space of ag conservation or amongst the farming population. So we're doing both a set of kind of lab and field experiments. And so we're collecting data from farmers specifically, not always tied to specific practices, but then we're also testing out these interventions in a field setting where we're engaging farmers with real money to put real practices in place. And then we're also even further kind of teasing out some of these ideas in other true lab research that doesn't involve farmers, just to kind of tease out and better understand mechanisms. So while we're looking at a lot of different things, the three I thought I would highlight, and I'm happy to talk more about later, is when we think about increasing motivation, so closing that initial gap for that 30 to 40% who say, yeah, I'm going to do it next year, but they don't get around to it. The behavioral literature would say that you can help to close that gap. You can help people take that next first step. And that next first step might just be having a conversation with another farmer advocate. It might be signing up for a program, right? So it's not necessarily what specific practice they put in place, but starting to move forward in their conservation journey. That we can do that by helping people to focus on their values, identifying why they would engage in conservation, how their current behavior is discrepant with those values, and then a plan for moving forward. And this planning part is important because while we do planning in conservation for farmers, we don't always do this type of planning, which is the if-then planning. So it's this idea that if I run into this challenge, I'm going to remind myself of why I'm doing this, and this is how I'm going to get around that barrier. So it's really focused on navigating some of those barriers, both by reminding yourself of your motivations, but also having a very concrete plan to navigate those challenges. We're also, again, focusing on removing those barriers. So in our partnership project that's related to this work that's funded through the RCPP, we are removing some of those traditional barriers. So we have somewhat unlimited technical assistance. We're providing really, really big social and economic incentives. We're removing the paperwork burden, right? We're trying to remove all of those traditional barriers to see if these extra motivational interventions can have that effect. And then for maintaining motivation, this one's a little trickier to study in the context of 2 years of funding with this particular program, but we're starting to look at that question of persistence and how providing feedback on positive change, so increasing numbers of acres, participants in a program, changes in environmental outcomes, how that can help farmers to maintain that intrinsic motivation they have to do conservation, even when those financial incentives go away. And so we're looking at this a little more theoretically in the context of this 2-year program, but in the context of this bigger, well, really 7-year field experiment, we'll be looking at those outcomes in a treatment watershed as well. So I will wrap up with my last couple minutes of just talking a little bit about our expected outcomes and some of those challenges and next steps. So our expected outcomes, again, when we get people to focus on their values, when we get them to think about how what they're doing is not in line with that, when we then help them develop a plan for navigating those things that have prevented them from taking that next step in the past, when we give them that opportunity to participate, we expect to see greater participation. So we're measuring both kind of antecedents of that participation metric. So increased energization is an idea in behavioral science of people essentially, after reflecting on those things and putting that plan together, are much more excited about taking that next step, whatever it is, and then it leads to a greater probability of taking that step. So in a lot of our kind of lab experiments, we can measure intentions, we can give them an opportunity to connect with an advocate. In our field experiment, we can actually give them an opportunity to participate in the program. And then throughout those field experiments in particular, we're measuring movement on those factors that help farmers maintain that kind of intrinsic motivation they already have to do conservation. Because if they lose that because they're being paid, then we often don't see that persistence that we want to see. And there's a lot of pieces that help maintain intrinsic motivation. Some of it is normative, like Jenny talked about. Some of it is getting that feedback about success. So we're tracking those pieces over time as well. And what I see as the challenges so far, again, this is a lot of basic work with a little bit of a kind of applied field research. But we really need, I think, better access to farmer subjects and data. So we know that these behavioral pieces are important, but a lot of the behavioral research is not in this context and is not with a farming population. And so we need to find better ways to get access to this information without overburdening farmers and understanding what the challenges are for them and how these interventions may or may not help. And I think we need better funding to support the long-term tracking of intervention effectiveness. So again, often our opportunities when we do have access to farmers as subjects, quote unquote, or when we do get access to data about conservation decisions, we don't have the funding or the time or the ability to really track that long enough to know if these interventions are effective and if they're leading to that long-term change. So I will stop with that. The QR code, if you're interested, just takes you to our lab website. And you can see more about this project and other projects that we're engaged in. So thanks.
Robin, thank you. That was great. What we really like about these three projects is they're three very different ideas for how to tackle the same problem. Tom's team is focused on facilitating technical, financial, and logistical support. Jenny's team is focusing on maximizing peer-to-peer learning opportunities. And Robin's team is using some of the same strategies, but framing the question and the challenge slightly differently and exploring whether that can have an effect on increasing and maintaining motivation to adopt these practices. We're excited for your questions, but also for your ideas about maybe what's missing or which hypothesis really resonated with you. And to facilitate that conversation, I'm excited to pass the ball to Paul, who's going to lead the discussion.
Thanks, Kathy. So feel free to raise your hand if you have questions that you want to ask, and we should be able to unmute you and allow you to ask those directly. We'll also take some in the chat. With Robin's comments there about data and access to farmers, that we did have one question that sort of asked about NASA's satellite data, but so they were curious about perspectives on use of information and the capacity to utilize things like how the NASA Ag program can be helpful in this. So I don't know if Robin, you want to answer that, but to how, satellite data, is that something that could be used to engage farmers or to understand what practices are being used, or how could we do more with that kind of information in this space?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. So in fact, in the context of this funding and what I just talked about, we submitted a revision to our scope of work to Kathy and the team, asking if we could buy some of that remotely sensed data at a field level that's already measured kind of classic conservation agriculture practices. So as measured rotations, presence of cover crops, and type of tillage. And the reason we want to do that is we became aware that we could get access to that without having to develop that from scratch. I think there are questions about the validity of some of that. I think there's more confidence maybe in the cover crop data, right? Because of the coloration and the way you can code that at big scales versus like the tillage data, which I think our team is maybe not as sure we put as much confidence in. But that's exactly what we're interested in using it for, is you could then have at a field scale across an entire state, across multiple states. I mean, that data is being analyzed and provided even outside of the United States. You really then could know exactly over time what's been done on a given field. If you could then pair that pattern of behavior over time with data from the individual, you could get a lot more insight into who's persisting in these practices, who's not, why might that be, we're even talking about trying to lay in NRCS data on engagement in programs, so that we would know, you can't know exactly who's doing what practice, but you can get from NRCS, this individual had X amount of funding through EQIP, right? And so we can even look at who are the people who are participating in programs and then continuing to do those practices after those incentives end. And I think that's one of the big challenges is right now we need to, and we pay farmers to start these practices, but it's well known in the literature, right, that when those incentives go away, most people stop. And so figuring out that persistence. So I think having data at those scales through satellite imagery could really help to solve some of those questions that we won't be able to answer otherwise.
Oh, can I ask a follow-up question? We often hear outreach practitioners say we know enough. We just need to build trust and get practices on the ground. And I wondered if the panelists could share their perspective about that view and also provide some guidance to researchers who are looking to improve the information, the decision support to enhance willingness and capacity to adopt the practices.
I mean, I can jump in with a thought since I'm off mute and then see what others think on that. But I don't disagree with that statement in the we know enough, because I think we do know a lot, and you've heard a lot of that already summarized today. We do know a lot about what motivates and what constrains farmers to do this work, but I think where we're dropping the ball is that we are not actively, this is an exception to the statement, but we are not actively funding or trying out innovative ways of engaging farmers, right? And so we're still relying on farm bill programs that we know are not sufficient and have too many challenges associated with them that are creating barriers for farmers. And so we should be doing more of these innovative sorts of approaches and understanding what their effect is. So on one hand, yes, I think we know enough. We don't need basic research, but I think we need more tests of innovative perspectives over time to really understand what can work.
Thanks. I have another question that is, I think, for Tom and Jenny more. How are you removing the paperwork burden, and how would that impact motivation if the burden eventually gets reintroduced? I think it seems like a lot of the batch and build is removing that burden. So
Yeah, I'll address the first part of that question. The reintroduction and is a little bit more challenging. That's one of the most innovative parts about the batch and build or the turnkey or some of these novel approaches, and that it establishes a fiscal agent, and that all payments, cost share payments, are assigned to that fiscal agent. A number of them are moving forward. The first one was Polk County, and other ones are like cities. City of Cedar Rapids, City of Ames has stepped in to act as that fiscal agent. Other non-governmental organizations have done that, and recently the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship has stepped into that role. So the way it works is that there's one contact to the landowner. They sign the agreements that payments will be assigned to this fiscal agent. That fiscal agent negotiates all the design. Frequently, there's a private engineering firm that's involved in that. Sometimes a state or federal agency is designing that. They negotiate then with the contractor for the establishment. There's generally an easement for ingress and egress, and then all payments are assigned to that fiscal agent. And so the landowner doesn't incur any tax burdens on that as well. So that's been one of the most innovative features of that. With respect to what happens if we go back to the old model, I don't know that I'm well versed to answer that question, but I do see that might be a real challenge, that once the landowner does interact with these low administrative hurdles and then goes back to the more conventional model, where that might be a disincentive.
thanks for that. I see one more question in the chat. How do the long-term research, how do these research projects align with long-term goals around measuring impacts, So I think this is, and how about, so impacts have on water conservation and carbon sequestration efforts. I think the question is getting at is, outcomes versus practice adoption. And is any of this looking at the outcomes in terms of environmental outcomes versus just, adoption of practices?
I'll jump in really quick, and probably Tom, I saw you go off. You probably have better things than I do, but I think that's where that sort of need for, I think both Robin and I talked about it, the need for sort of that long-term follow-up is really important. I mean, I think there's not a lot of space currently, and there's not a lot of funding currently for that long-term follow-up, and so I think more efforts to do that kind of follow-up will be really insightful.
So that is a larger component of the research program here at Iowa State University is to quantify those water quality and other ecosystem service benefits. We have a number of sites out there that have full monitoring, and yeah, Jenny, they are expensive, and long-term funding is a challenge to achieve those long-term goals. The advantage for this program with the FFAR research is that a component of that is that we're taking the 250 sites and we're trying to harvest all that data, put it into a database, and then start to say, okay, well, of these 250 sites, and apply the research data and say, what would be the pounds of N reduced over all of that implementation for these larger programs. And then as we go to work with other states, the one opportunity that exists there is that to work with those researchers in those other sites to utilize their data or to increase the data as we implement these practices in different landscape positions, different farming practices, and to try to expand the knowledge.
Great. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to add one quick thought to that. Yeah, I'm in Jenny's camp of like, this is where you need more time. So we're partnering with the RCPP, which is a 5-year project measuring soil health and nutrient loss and water quality. So we will have it, but it's at such a small scale that it doesn't work well for our behavioral questions because we only have like 30 farmers in our treatment watershed to work with and 30 in our control. So there's mismatches sometimes with that. And so we rely on modeling a lot, working with SWOT modelers and others to try to like scale up what the impact of these sorts of programs or adoption potential would be at a watershed scale. And so that's one way we get around that, I think, when we don't have the time or the money or the ability to actually measure those physical pieces.
Great. Kathy, any
Yeah, one closing question for the panel. Paul and I have had many discussions about the need to reach out to recognize the diversity of farmers across the US. And I wonder if you could share thoughts about, these different outreach strategies and how they are more or less effective, or are they truly allowing us to reach that diverse community? I don't know, Robin, I see you shaking your head, so maybe
I already hinted at this, and I apologize to my federal friends on the call, but I'm very disappointed that we spend so much money through our federal programs in a way that's only reaching those innovators and those early adopters. I mean, that's the preaching to the choir problem that Jenny talked about, is we've stalled out, and those are the people willing to go that extra mile and jump through those hurdles and to take those risks and all that, right? And so we really do have to do something different for this middle group, and so kudos to FAR and Walton Family for, giving opportunities to look into these sorts of things, because there aren't a lot of mechanisms to try things, to do things differently.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jenny.
I was just going to add quickly, just to build off of what Robin said, I do think that sort of reaching sort of those more diverse audiences, they do require a deliberate outreach approach, and, not one size fits all with these things. And so really designing those approaches based on what we know from the social science about how to reach these audiences. But then also, I think this is sort of implicit in all of our projects, is that relationship building is so crucial to reaching those more diverse audiences. And that's, again, where sort of the long-term need is those relationships take time to build. And so, I think that's another key element.
Well, our time is just about up. I want to thank our speakers, Tom, Robin, Jenny. This has been a wonderful whirlwind tour of some fantastic work, not only to increase the effectiveness of our outreach, but I think also to shed some light on how we can better integrate our efforts for those of us who work more on the social science side and the biophysical side, and how can we align that work together to advance our sustainability initiatives. So, and again, thank you, Paul, and the Walton Family Foundation for all your support in developing this program and supporting our grantees. And to all, we look forward to connecting or continuing this conversation in follow-up meetings and outreach. Please keep in touch, and look forward to working together. Thank you.